Good day, everybody. My name is Boulet. I'm the agricultural fieldman for the municipal district of Smoky River. I'm also a certified crop advisor, and the Peace Region Fieldmen's Association committee, who hosts the weed inspector workshop and the spray crew workshop, asked if I would do some type of a session on weed biology. So what I've decided to do is do a video so we can post it on YouTube and people can watch it as often or not at all if they want to. So I'm going to be talking about weed biology, and what I decided to do is pick half a dozen species, explain what in my mind makes them such a problematic species, and talk about using some of their weaknesses against them to gain control of them. So first thing I would want to say is all of the weeds that I'm going to be talking about, all the invasive plants, were all introduced to North America. None of them are native species to North America. They were all introduced mostly from Europe, sometimes from Eurasia, sometimes from South America, but the ones I'm talking about were all European or Eurasian. So they were introduced into North America. Sometimes they were introduced by accident, like wild oats was brought in as an impurity in cereal seeds. Sometimes they were brought in on purpose, either as an ornamental or for medicinal qualities. So chamomile, brought in because of chamomile tea and because people thought it was pretty, reminded them of the old country. Tansy, brought in for medicinal properties. So they're introduced, and what happens when you get a species introduced to a new ecosystem, when they don't bring their predators with them, you end up with a bigger issue. In Europe, you've got insects, you've got diseases that tend to keep these plants in check. They get here and they find that, hey, I like it here. I don't have these insects that keep me from producing lots of seeds, so I can just give it a free-for-all. So talking about biological control, and I'm going to deal with biological control of weeds. It's a huge field of research, and it's also one where extreme caution is needed. There are many countries that have introduced biological controls, predators, hoping that they would deal with a problem, only to find out that now they've introduced a new predator that doesn't have anything else to keep it in check, and it becomes more of a problem than an answer. So a lot of testing has to happen before a potential biological control agent can be released. We need to be assured that the biological control agent will not negatively affect native plants that we have here. We want to make sure that if that biological control agent runs out of its species that it's supposed to be attacking, pretty much it needs to die. It can't just continue on and become a problem in our ecosystem. So biocontrol agents, they're great for keeping a population low. They don't really get into completely getting rid of a certain species, because if they did, they would disappear. So what you'll end up having is biocontrol agents that bring the populations down. Populations go back up a little bit, the biocontrol agent population comes up, get back down, and it just does a little steady ebb and flow, keeping it at a constant level, not getting rid of it completely, but keeping it from becoming a bigger problem. So think about it like we have with mice and coyotes. Mouse populations ramp up, coyote populations build up behind them, they start having more pups. Coyote population goes up to the point where it brings the mice population down, and then the coyote population has to crash. Disease, they make less pups. So it's just a constant ebb and flow of predator and prey imbalance. So my intention with the video is to describe what strengths certain weeds have, what is it that makes them formidable, and what weaknesses do we have that we can hopefully exploit. So just to start, shortly after the earth cooled, and I was in Fairview College, I was taking my weeds course. My instructor at the time, Dave Buck, one day was talking about weed biology, talking about different strengths that certain plants have. And he's talking about, of course, how much seed they produce, how long the seeds stay dormant, whether they have spines on them, whether they taste bitter so livestock and other animals don't chew on them, whether they have allelopathic qualities, which would be exuding chemicals into the soil around them to keep other species from growing, whether they might have a waxy cuticle, which makes them more difficult to get a herbicide into. So as I sat in class, I started thinking about, all right, well, what are the main strengths that a plant can have. And I started noting those down, and when I became a weed inspector or fieldman, that's when I started learning about scentless chamomile, and that's when I realized that chamomile checks off a lot of the boxes. Alright, so now we're going to talk about scentless chamomile, one of my absolutely favorite plants. Scentless chamomile originated in Europe, and it now appears all over the world. So the question has to be, why did this particular weed, why is it so successful? Why has it done so well wherever it has grown? Well, first off, what you're looking at is a plant that will act as an annual, a biannual, winter annual, perennial. So whatever type of a cropping system or competition you throw at it, it will live in there. So today we're in a cereal field. We picked this plant. It is definitely an overwintered perennial or biannual plant. You can tell by this how big it is. We're looking at currently the 29th of June 2020. So what you have here is what, in my opinion, is the best control method for scentless chamomile. Scentless chamomile grows only from seed. It doesn't have a creeping root system, and to me that's probably one of its few weaknesses. It makes a lot of seed, but it doesn't have a creeping root system to support it. So if you can get most of that root out of there when you pull it, you've killed the plant. Now if you take this particular plant and you throw it onto the ground, that is still going to produce seed. As soon as those flowers have opened, they have viable seed. And every day that they are allowed to continue to live, they're just making more and more seed. They're getting pollinated, and they're producing seed after seed after seed. Really, that is the key with chamomile, is keeping it from producing seed. One plant is capable of producing up to 1 million seeds per year. One of the reasons that it's such a problem is its indeterminate growth habit. So, what I mean by an indeterminate growth habit, another name for scentless chamomile is mayweed. Quite often, when the conditions are good, you will see biannual or perennial plant that is blooming in May. Well, those blooms are going to be done by the end of June, but that same plant has a bunch more blooms. So every month that it's allowed to live, it's making new blooms, it's setting more seed. Those flowers are open in May. By the end of June, the seed is dropping to the ground. Some of that seed is germinating, and you've got more plants already coming in that same year. This plant, if left alone, would continue to bloom and make seed until it hit about -10. So it could be May weed, June weed, July weed, August weed, all the way into November before winter finally shuts it down, and then it starts up again. Come next spring, you still got that perennial plant that is potentially going to start growing again. So to put it in perspective, canola. We like canola, it grows well in our area. One plant of canola from one seed will produce about 300 seeds. And that'll give you approximately a 50 bushel crop of canola. One flower of chamomile can produce about 300 seeds. So when you think about that, how many flowers does it take to produce 1 million seeds on that same plant in 1 year? You're talking over 1,000 flowers on that one plant. So if you give it a lot of competition, you won't have that many flowers, you won't have that much seed production, but you're still going to have thousands, potentially 500,000 seeds produced that year on that one plant, because it's just going to keep flowering until something happens to it. So pulling it, very good control method. Mowing it at this point is really bad, because if you've mowed it, those blooms that were open that have now set seed, you spread it with the mower, and wherever you're going next with that mower until it's cleaned, you're probably spreading seeds. So really, before it goes to bloom, by all means mow it. Once it goes to bloom, the only way you can really prevent it from going to seed, pull it, bag it, incinerate it, or bury it deep where it can't possibly come back from. So even a herbicide at this stage, you're still going to have some seed set. Those flowers have set viable seed. If you spray it today, you're going to have a lot less seed because a lot of those other flowers are not going to be able to make viable seed, but these have. So you're looking at a herbicide option. If that is your only option, you've got a major patch that is not pickable, then yeah, herbicide. But now you've got to be thinking, I have seed on the ground. So if I'm going to have seed on the ground, what would work best is to have a residual herbicide, so when the seeds germinate, you still have some herbicide in the ground to kill them. So strengths with chamomile, it can handle any growing situation, annual crop, biennial crop, perennial crop. It'll be a problem in any of them. However, the seeds themselves, when they germinate, are not particularly tough. If you can give it a lot of competition, really heavy grass cover for instance, when the seed germinates, that little seedling isn't going to make it through the competition, it's going to die. What you'll see along the roads, usually you'll see chamomile growing right on the shoulder of the road because it can handle the salt, but it can't handle the competition. So in the bottom of the ditch, you might see oxeye daisy. You won't typically see chamomile unless there's no competition. So look for it on the edge of the road and look for it on the edge of the field where you've got no competition because the ditch and the field haven't got the competition together. So other things that cause it to be an issue when you're spraying is the fine leaf that it has. You're looking at really not a lot of leaf when you spray it. A lot of that spray just goes straight through and hits the ground. So not much leaf to be able to pick up the herbicide. So again, a residual herbicide that will be also picked up by the roots will give you better control. So when you're spraying, you want to get very thorough coverage, and again, preferably you're looking at something that has residual, or even better, pulling the plants and disposing of them so that they can't set seed. When you're dealing with a long-term infestation, you've had an infestation, it's gone to seed year after year, you're looking at a potential seed bank that is basically as long as most people will survive. Alberta Agriculture had done some research a long time ago that said you were looking at 65% viability of the seed after 20 years in the soil. So I'm not sure how far out they went with that, but after 20 years, you're still looking at 65% viability. So if you think about that from the point of view of, if you have 1 million seeds on one plant, and even if 10% of them, only 10% of them grow, you're still talking about 100,000 new plants. So every year, you have the potential of building seed bank very, very quickly. Really good sod-bound grass, because then you can also spray it as well as pick the plants that escape. The sod is going to keep the new seedlings from being able to establish, so you can control it that way if you've got a lot of seed. Pasture, though, is not a great alternative. The cows or livestock generally don't like it that much. So they'll eat it when it's fairly young, but once it gets stemmy, especially an older plant like this, the stems are really tough. Livestock generally will not really eat it, so they eat all around it, eat the competition. They will nibble on the flowers, which you would think, all right, well, we've controlled the seed. However, even a ruminant, you're still looking at about 11% of the viable seed will go through the animal and come out the other end, sitting in some nice fertilizer. So pasture, it's not a great option. The other thing is with pasture is, especially if you're grazing it when it's fairly wet, the cattle will punch through the sod, and wherever they've punched through, or if you go in with a piece of equipment, wherever it punches through, you've got bare soil and you've got chamomile growing again. Cattle also as well, with the cloven hoof, pick plants up and they will transport them around, especially if it's wet, they'll just rip out the plants and they'll bring it to start new patches. Okay, I will be dealing with Canadian thistle and perennial sow thistle together. They aren't the same species, but they do have fairly similar strengths and weaknesses. Both spread primarily by creeping root, but with perennial sow thistle, it tends to go by seed more than Canada thistle. Canada thistle really does count on its creeping root system. So when you're looking at Canada thistle, you'll tend to find that it's in much stronger colonies or patches. And those colonies will usually be, or quite often be, one plant and usually one sex. Canada thistle has male plants and female plants. Perennial sow thistle has a perfect flower. It has both male and female flowers on it, so it's making seed, and you can count on it to make a lot more seed. Where you're dealing with both male and female plants, so quite often in a patch it'll be one colony, one complete plant, all hooked together underground. So here's a patch of female, you have to have a patch of male somewhere, and pollinators going back and forth to end up with viable seed production. So with Canada thistle, what you'll find is you don't have a lot of seed because of the male and female plants, but you also have a very heavy seed. So even the seed that is produced doesn't tend to go very far, where perennial sow thistle, the seeds tend to blow a lot further. So in a field, you'll have perennial sow thistle kind of spread throughout. Canada thistle, you'll deal with really dense patches because the seed is just getting dropped off very quickly. You'll see fluff flying for miles, but very, very rarely will you have seed that goes much further than about 10 meters from the parent plant. The other thing that you'll find with Canada thistle is you have stem mining weevils, as well as a weevil that lays eggs in the seed head itself, and the weevil larvae feed on the eggs. So again, quite often you'll open up the seed or the head and you'll see, yeah, it's got fluff, but the seeds are being consumed by a weevil. So you're not dealing with a lot of seed production from Canada thistle. It really is the root that you have to deal with. The root system tends to make Canada thistle more successful in pasture situations than perennial sow thistle, and also the spininess tends to make it that the cattle or livestock are avoiding it. So the livestock chew all around the thistle, take out the competition, the thistle is free to just keep on going. So you'll see it becoming much more of an issue in a pasture situation. Both of them can be very much of a problem in almost any crop situation, whether it's an annual crop like cereals, or a biennial crop, or a perennial crop, because they're coming back from root perennially year after year. In annual cropping situations, the best time to control the thistles is in the fall. So when we go out as farmers, we're doing, let's say, a pre-seed burn-off, or we're spraying just before the crop comes out of the ground, the thistles generally are not out of the ground. So we're applying a herbicide, but we're not getting that thistle. In crop, you're dealing with a plant that's coming from the root system. All of its energy is focused on getting a plant up and making seed. So it's really not bringing any herbicide down into the root system. So when you spray, quite often what you'll do is you'll see suppression, you'll see top growth burn down, but you're not going to get it into the root system. So what I found that works quite well is looking at suppressing it in crop, just keeping it from going to seed, and hoping that come fall you're dealing with a plant that's either in bud or an early flower, and at that point it's reversing direction of the food flow. It's going to try to feed its roots to get ready for the next year and to make more plants. You spray it at that time and you end up with a lot of the herbicide going into the root system and killing the root system. Cultivation can work, and especially with Canada thistle, you're dealing with a plant that can regenerate from very, very small root pieces. So if you cultivate, really initially what you're doing is you're spreading it around. You're chopping it up into little bits of plant, spreading it around. If you don't do anything further, you just have ended up making your population thinner, but more widespread throughout the field. So if you're talking about cultivating, trying to summer fallow Canada thistle, you pretty much need to have 2 years of constant cultivation to starve that root system. And every time that plant, before it gets into bud, you're cultivating it again, because every time it gets into at least bud stage, the food is going back into the root zone. What you're trying to do is deplete the roots. In a pasture situation, you can look at mowing, but again, the same thing. You're looking at mowing or cutting those plants off every time they come into bud. So you might be out there 3, 4, 5 times in the season if your growing conditions are right. I have found that works quite well in a pasture situation is if you can get your hands on a wick applicator, or if your municipality rents one, having wick applicator, giving it to the farmer for use. Grazing takes out all the competition. You end up with your thistle up in bud, early bloom. You go out and you wick. You're not using a lot of herbicide. You can use fairly inexpensive, non-selective herbicides because you're only wicking onto the thistle. You're not going to get them all because some of them will be low growing still, but you'll get good translocation into the root system. You might do that 3 or 4 times in the season again instead of mowing, and every time that patch is getting thinner and thinner, replenished with herbicide instead of with food, and thinning it out. After a few years, you should be able to pretty much get rid of it without using hardly any herbicide, and also not having to go out and spray a general broadleaf that also kills all of your legumes and other broadleaf plants. So I don't have an oxeye daisy to share with you, so I'll just tell you, why am I wearing the same shirt for the 3rd time, shooting 3 different videos over the course of several weeks? Well, of course I'm a proud Canadian, that's got to be one thing. But the reason being is I thought it would be a good background for most of the weeds that we're talking about. So oxeye daisy is a perennial plant. It's confused often by chamomile, although as soon as you see it, as soon as you see the leaf structure, you know it's not something's chamomile. Oxeye spreads by seed, but also spreads by creeping root, but not like a Canada thistle where you end up with roots spreading plants many feet away from the parent plant. This one just clumps, but you'll end up with oxeye daisy plants that you go to dig them up and you find a plant that's 1/2 meter in diameter, all root system. So digging it out can be quite the chore, although it is a really good way to get rid of it, because again, when you're dealing with something like oxeye, a lot of cases you're dealing with a sensitive area, you're dealing with it around people's yards, in their flower beds. Herbicides are not going to be a very good option. In something like a lawn, when you see the oxeye daisy has moved off or into a roadside ditch, then something like clopyralid works quite well on it. But you want to make sure you're leaving the grass, so you don't want to go in there with something that's non-selective. In a yard site, you will often run into people telling you that what they have is Shasta daisy. And it's very possible that they had Shasta daisy at one point, but Shasta has oxeye as a parent plant, and it will revert back to an oxeye daisy over time, especially if it's left out in the wild or out in the elements. My litmus test that I look at is if it's setting seed and spreading, it's no longer a Shasta daisy. It is now oxeye. So if you're looking at the basal leaves, Shasta daisy will have that long, feathery, kind of serrated leaf. Oxeye daisy will be more like a spoon, where you've got this long, narrow spoon handle with a lobed face. So if it's spreading, chances are you're no longer dealing with Shasta daisy, you're dealing with oxeye. Agriculturally, oxeye is mostly a pasture weed. Livestock don't prefer it, so they will graze around it, take out the competition, and it just gets bigger and bigger, makes seed, just spreads very well. So in a pasture, if you're going out spraying it, chances are you're going to be using a herbicide that's selective for broadleaves, and you're going to end up taking out all the legumes and any other broadleaf plants that are out there. So you're going to be left with grass, in which case good advice for the landowner is go in with nitrogen. Encourage that grass competition. It'll outcompete the oxeye, and maybe then all you're left with is pulling a few plants or mowing it before it gets into seed. So same in the lawn, a selective broadleaf herbicide, and encourage the competition to make sure you've got as competitive a grass stand as you possibly can. So the first 4 weeds that I've talked about are in the sunflower or Compositae family. They tend to produce a lot of seed, and they've been very successful in North America, but just keep in mind they've all been introduced. Alright, so now we're going to talk about common yellow toadflax. And unfortunately that's not in bloom, but if it was, you'd have that nice yellow and white snapdragon flower. Toadflax is a perennial that spreads primarily by creeping root, but it also makes seed. Like the thistles, it does tend to be late in coming in the season, so quite often when we're doing a pre-seed burn-off or trying to spray in crop, we're not hitting it because it hasn't come out of the ground yet. It's still below ground by the root, and it comes out a little bit later on. So even early in-crop herbicides, you still might be missing it or just barely hitting it as it's coming out of the ground. Herbicide-wise as well, it has a thick, waxy cuticle, and that makes it very difficult to get herbicide into the plant. So if you are spraying and your target is toadflax, you might want to make sure that you're using a really high quality surfactant, something that will burn off the cuticle and get that herbicide into the plant. Like thistles, what you're looking for mostly is in-crop suppression. You're not going to find a herbicide that's going to kill this plant in crop. Maybe in a pasture where you can go at really high rates, But in crop, you're pretty much only counting on suppression and hoping to come back in the fall and either hitting it in the fall after harvest or say with a pre-harvest herbicide. And again, surfactant, making sure that it's got a good surfactant to get that herbicide in through the cuticle. The toad flax, because it has a very shallow creeping root system, if you're dealing with it in a yard situation, just a small patch, it can be dug up, but you've got to dig up all of that root. So it's typically not something you're going to get on the first try or even after several tries. You just have to keep at it, keep pulling it out, digging up, getting out all that creeping root system. The seeds float really well in water, so it's something where if you've got a patch of it and you've got water flowing over the terrain or it's close to a ditch, it will flow downstream and it'll start new patches further away from the parent plants. So again, I mean, mostly you're dealing with the creeping root system, but it does spread by seed as well. So control-wise, you're looking at fall herbicide and making sure that you can get through that waxy cuticle. So now we're going to talk about Dame's Rocket. Dame's Rocket is a fairly new addition to the Weed Control Act. New in the sense that it was only added in 2010. And we don't really see it as being much of a crop weed. It's more of a plant of sensitive areas like riparian areas, and agriculturally I would say it's more of a pasture weed. It's a biennial, spreads only by seed, has a tap root, so actually pulling it generally is pretty easy and a pretty decent way to deal with it. Because it only spreads by seed, if you can pull it, discard it, burn it, it hasn't gone anywhere. Mowing it works fairly well as long as it hasn't gone to seed. So a plant in bloom, not a problem, it can be mowed. As a biennial, what you'll find though is that it tends to keep alive until it can get up and go to seed. So you'll find patches where a person has been mowing it for years and all of a sudden it gets too wet, they go away for a little while and off it comes up into bloom fairly early, so then it's really visible. So in a riparian area, sensitive areas like somebody's yard where they don't want herbicides being used, pulling it is definitely a very good control measure. If it's something that was too much to be pulled, then you're looking at very few herbicide options, especially because it's most likely going to be along a water course. So close to the water, you're looking at possibly metsulfuron methyl, maybe triclopyr, not a lot of choices. Being in the mustard family, something like clopyralid or Lontrell isn't going to touch it, same family as canola.